Hello everyone, welcome to week 2 of your Introduction to Creative Writing class. This week we're going to be learning about internal structure in poetry, specifically imagery, word choice, shifts, things like that. But before we do, I want to remind you that this week you have your first poetry workshop. That's going to be in the discussion board in the week 2 folder. So at the end of this video, I'm going to give you some quick thoughts, kind of notes on how to do constructive criticism. Nothing crazy complicated, just my general rules on how I do constructive criticism in my class. Also, like last week, if you haven't done the readings for this week, go ahead and do them and then come back and watch this video. That's how I want you to do it every week. It might help you if you do the readings since they're short. It's only a couple poems. If you do the readings, watch this video, go back and do the readings if you have time for that. But if you don't have time for that, I would like you to do the readings, then watch this video. Okay, so internal structure. Last week we talked about external structure, which is the thing that forms the poem, the thing that frames the poem. So like we talked about stanzas, which are like the poem's paragraphs. We talked about rhyme schemes and meter, which is like the rhythm or the beat of the poem. Internal structure is a little less concrete than that. Things that might fall under the category of internal structure of a poem is things like imagery, things like diction, like I said, word choice, how something sounds sonically pleasing without necessarily being like a rhythm or a rhyme. So the first thing, the first type of internal structure I want to talk about is a tone shift. A tone shift is something that you'll see in poetry and fiction. It's actually very common in fiction as well. An example of a tone shift in fiction might be like in a comedy, where you have that moment where you're laughing, it's really funny, and you're like, ha 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 ha, and then like it gets really real all of a sudden, you're like, oh, that got super real super fast, right? But that shift from laughing to like really serious all of a sudden in like in fiction is a form of tone shift, and if done well, it can be really effective. And there are similar tone shifts in poetry. The most common tone shift in poetry is where something goes from, oh, this is a nice poem, this is gentle and it's soft, and oh, that hurts, that's emotions. And then it can also go the other way, where it starts like in this like really intense emotional state, and then by the end you've ended up with something kind of like nice and soft. For example, in the things we read this week, Two-Headed Calf by Laura Gilpin. I'm gonna go ahead and read it because it's very short. And I want you to listen for where you think the tone shifts in this poem. So the poem goes, "Tomorrow when the farm boys find this freak of nature, they will wrap his body in newspaper and carry him to the museum. But tonight he is alive and in the north field with his mother. It is a perfect summer evening, the moon rising over the orchard, the wind in the grass, and as he stares into the sky, there are twice as many stars as usual." So it's a very short poem, which means the tone shift, the moment that things change, has to be fairly quick. And the moment things change is in between the third and the fourth line. So you have this opening image of the farm boys finding this dead two-headed calf, right? And it's horrible and it's tragic, and they call it, the poet Gilpin calls this two-headed calf a freak of nature, and they will wrap his body in newspaper and carry him to the museum. And then in the fourth line, there's this tone shift. But tonight he is alive and in the north field with his mother, right? So this is a way of creating structure in poetry without it being about stanzas and rhyme and stuff like that. The structure is in that very subtle shift from talking about a dead calf who's a freak of nature to, but tonight he's alive and it's beautiful and the orchard is beautiful and there's wind in the grass, and that kind of tone shift can add structure to a poem. The opposite type of tone shift, going from this nice image to something more serious, can happen. I didn't assign you this poem, but there's this poem called Mint by Seamus Heaney, who's a wonderful Irish poet. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it begins with Heaney talking about picking mint from his backyard on a Sunday, and there's beautiful lines. It begins like, it looked like a clump of small dusty nettles growing wild at the gable of the house. There are lines, the snip of the scissor blades, the light of Sunday mornings where the mint was cut and loved. And then the last stanza, you have this wonderful tone shift. So the last stanza goes, let the smell of mint go heady and defenseless, like the inmates liberated in that yard, like the disregarded ones we turned against because we'd failed them by our disregard. So you have this beginning of talking about, oh no, my cat's come. Hello. You have this beginning of talking about the mint and his backyard and all these wonderful images of a Sunday morning and the light and everything, and then it shifts to like the inmates liberated in that yard, like the disregarded ones we turned against because we'd failed them in our disregard. So there's this moment where instead of us talking about mint and a beautiful garden, Heaney all of a sudden is like, but listen, listen to these issues of injustice and incarceration and being failed by the justice system. And you're suddenly, like, as the reader, you're pulled in and kind of pulled back because of that. And so that's another way to do a tone shift, right? Is to start out in this kind of meandering way and then pull you into something very real and very grounding. Another type of tone shift, or rather another type of shift in a poem rather than a tone shift, is a meaning shift. So one thing you can do in poetry is a word or phrase in a poem can start out meaning one thing and by the end of the poem mean something very, very different. For example, we read One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. And when you read it, it begins with, the art of losing isn't hard to master, right? And she keeps repeating all these things that you can lose. She says you can lose something every day, lose your keys, practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, where you meant to travel. None of these things will bring disaster, right? So she's repeating all these things that you can lose, and it's not going to be a disaster. And if you notice, if you read it again, the things that she's losing are getting bigger, right? I lost 2 cities, lovely ones. I lost realms, rivers, continents. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. That's what she writes. And she ends it, the last stanza, she ends it, even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied, it's evident, the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. So, as she's repeating, the art of losing's not too hard to master, it wasn't a disaster, losing is not difficult, losing is not difficult. If you repeat something enough, the opposite becomes true, right? So if you say, I'm not mad, over and over, you're like, I'm not mad, I'm not mad, I'm not mad, I'm not mad, right? Eventually someone's gonna be like, I think you might be mad, right? So there's this technique of repetition and shifting meaning, where if you say something and you say it enough, the opposite's going to become true. And Elizabeth Bishop does that really, really wonderfully with One Art, because she begins with telling you, losing things isn't hard. I can lose my keys, I can lose this, I can lose that. And by the end, what she's saying is losing things is very, very difficult, right? Okay, moving on. So another thing I want to talk about in poetry, a type of internal structure, is the imagery, right? This is something that you're probably familiar with, at least in theory. The imagery is quite simply the images conjured in a poem, right? So there are 3 types of imagery that I want to talk about that I think are going to be useful for you when you're writing your poems this week. The first is the concept of very, very simple imagery. Then I want to talk about how you can defy expectations with imagery and how you can reverse senses. So, simple, effective imagery is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, you don't have to have these like mind-blowing images and complex scenes you're putting together. The images can be very simple, like in Two-Headed Calf, the wind and the breeze and the through the orchard. Like, it's not a super complicated sentence structure. It's not a super complicated image she's putting together. It's a very simple one. And the same goes for the poem that we read this week, At a Deli Counter in Vermont, by Stephanie Burt. So a couple lines from that is like when she's writing about ordering this sandwich, right? And she says, "The burly guy with the roller stash, you lean on the counter and focus on condensation, the chill on your palms and forearms." So these kind of images and like sensory things that she's trying to conjure up. It's not complicated, right? It's very easy to picture. But these simple images save room for this like really lovely, huge revelation at the end of the poem, where she writes, "Is that your order, ma'am?" You startle, and then apologize for taking up his time. But he called you ma'am, so you don't mind. And the context for this is that Stephanie Burt is a trans woman, and so the idea and the excitement she writes about when she was transitioning, the excitement of being called ma'am was like so much and so exciting for her that someone recognized her as a woman, and that's where the poem gets its complexity. So the imagery is very simple, and you can have poems with very simple imagery, but the thing going on behind it, whether it's the story or the idea or whatever, is where you get that complexity, right? So as far as defying expectations with images, the poem you read this week by Ocean Vuong, Essay and Craft, begins with this image of the butterfly, right? Which is very often thought of as a kind of whimsical image, but Vuong turns it on its head, this image of the kind of lovely, soft, whimsical butterfly, by making the butterfly's transformation very grisly. The last several lines of the poem are, "So I dipped my fingers back into the fire, pried open the lower face until the wound widened into a throat, until every leaf shook silver with that god-awful scream, and I was done, and it was human." So we have these images of what we think a butterfly is, or what we think a butterfly's transformation is, and all this stuff. And then what Ocean Vuong does is he creates this kind of awful, almost, like horrific idea of a transformation. So that's another thing you can do with images. You can take something, like flowers, or a nice little cat who's still sitting on my lap, and then you can turn on your head what the audience thinks you're going to do with that image, right? And then lastly, I wanted to talk about how to reverse senses with an image. So this is another poem that I didn't make you read, but it's super short. It's called Honeysuckle by Lynn Lifshin. and I'm going to read it really quick. It goes, bees, my skin smells of sun, the insides of roses. I want to eat that light. Everything that grows does. So something like eat that light or smell the sun. Excuse me. Obviously, you can't eat light. The sun doesn't smell like anything, or at least not from Earth. But reversing these senses and creating these images of eating light or smelling sun gives the imagery that you're creating a kind of twist, like you do when you like you would when you're like reversing an expectation of the image, like we do with the butterfly in Ocean Vuong's poem. If you are going to reverse senses, like you know, how do you touch a color or smell a sound or something like that, when you're reversing that image, if you want to do that in your poem, which I really love it when poems do stuff like that, you do want to think about like how easy is that to picture. Like, I can't actually smell the sun, but I can like imagine what it would be like to have that smell, or I can't eat light, but like that's something I can like feasibly imagine. If you're reversing a sense, and it's like completely incomprehensible, it can end up having the opposite effect. It can kind of make you pull back as a reader and be like, what does that even mean, right? But if it's something like strange but imaginable, then that can be something really cool to put in your poem. Okay, so that's all I have on internal structure. These are just some things that I want you to think about when you are writing your poem this week, whether you're doing the sonnet or the other option. I want you to be thinking about how to use imagery effectively, how to do tone shifts, things like that. So, really quick. Constructive criticism. When you are reading each other's poems this week, I know that you all are very nice people. I know that you're not going to be mean, but rule 1, don't be mean. Don't be things I shouldn't say in a professional setting. Treat their work with kindness, treat it with respect. A lot of the times, the criticisms or the comments you might have are not so much things that actually need to change, but they're like creative differences. Just because you might have different sensibilities or different aesthetics or different things you want from a poem. So keep that in mind. My second rule is to please remember that you are not your classmate's editor. So you're giving suggestions, not corrections. You're not saying, here are the things you need to change, you know? You're saying, when I was reading it, I was thinking about this aspect, and it could be interesting to do this, right? So you're not editing them, you're not telling them how to change it, right? You're merely giving suggestions or observations. My third rule is that I would like you to try to give a reason for that critique. Don't just say like, I didn't think this part was convincing, or I didn't like this too much. Say, you know, I didn't think this was convincing because this imagery was confusing, or this imagery didn't match what was happening in lines 5 and 6, you know? Like, try to be specific with your criticism and try to give a reason for it. So, yeah, 3 rules. Don't be mean, don't be their editor, and try to give a reason for the critiques that you give. I'm really excited to read your poems. I hope you had a good first week in this class and any other classes you are taking right now. But yeah, that's all for now. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.